Manuscript Bruce 74 sits in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. It is one of 3 Ethiopian Ge'ez manuscripts of the Book of Enoch that the Scottish explorer James Bruce carried out of Ethiopia in 1773. It is the primary manuscript source for every modern English translation of the Book of Parables, chapters 37 through 71 of 1st Enoch, the section that describes what the text calls the kings and the mighty. Those 3 words, in their authenticated Ge'ez form, are the center of one of the most genuinely interesting debates in Enoch scholarship. Not because of what they might mean for the future, because of what they meant in the Second Temple Jewish world that produced them, because of the precise way 3 of the most respected Enoch scholars of the 20th century translated them differently from each other, and because of a genuine and documented anomaly in the Qumran manuscript record that no one has fully explained. This documentary examines what the Book of Parables actually says about the kings and the mighty, what the scholarly record documents about the passage, and what the absence of the parables from Qumran actually means, and does not mean, for how the text should be understood. Before we go further, subscribe now if this kind of textual and historical exploration is what you are here for. Every week this channel examines ancient texts, scholarly debates, and interpretive questions at the edges of mainstream scholarship. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The Qumran Enoch fragments, designated 4Q201 through 4Q212, are real and held at the Israel Antiquities Authority in Jerusalem. They were recovered from Cave 4 between 1947 and 1952 and have been dated by paleographic analysis to the late 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. These fragments preserve substantial portions of 1st Enoch in Aramaic. What they preserve specifically, the Book of the Watchers, the Astronomical Book, the Book of Dream Visions, the Epistle of Enoch, and related material including the Book of Giants. This is documented and not in dispute. What they do not preserve, the Book of Parables, chapters 37 through 71. No Aramaic fragment from the Parables section has been identified in the Qumran collection. This absence is real, documented, and has been the subject of sustained scholarly debate since the fragments were published. This absence matters because Enoch was one of the most heavily represented texts in the Qumran library, 11 copies, making it among the most copied texts in the entire collection. The absence of the parables from this otherwise extensive Enoch corpus is not a minor gap. It is a genuine and unresolved scholarly puzzle. The complete parables section exists only in the Ethiopian Ge'ez manuscripts preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, specifically in the manuscripts James Bruce brought to Europe in 1773, which formed the basis for all subsequent English translations. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church's continuous preservation of 1st Enoch in its biblical canon, outside the authority of the Roman Church councils that excluded it in the West, is documented and historically significant. The source material for this documentary cites real scholars accurately. This is worth confirming because it is unusual in this genre. Robert Henry Charles produced the standard Oxford English edition of 1st Enoch in 1906. Michael Gnibb of King's College London produced the definitive critical Ge'ez edition for Oxford University Press in 1978. Ephraim Isaac produced a direct translation from the Ge'ez for the Old Testament Pseudepigrapha series in 1983. George Nicholsburg of the University of Iowa published the definitive Hermeneia commentary on 1st Enoch for Fortress Press in 2001. Joseph Millick published the critical edition of the Qumran Enoch fragments, the Aramaic Enoch, for Oxford University Press in 1976. Gabriele Boccaccini edited the landmark 2007 conference volume Enoch and the Messiah, Son of Man, that brought together the major voices in the scholarly debate about the parable's date and origin. These are all real scholars with verifiable published work. The source material's characterization of their positions is largely accurate and is confirmed below. Joseph Millick's argument that the Book of Parables was not found at Qumran because it did not yet exist, having been composed as a Christian text after the Qumran community ceased copying, is real and documented in his 1976 Oxford volume. This argument is accurately described in the source material. What is also accurately described, the mainstream rejection of Millick's position. Nicholsburg's rejection of the Christian composition theory is documented in his 2001 commentary. Vanderkam's rejection is documented in his published work on the Enochic tradition. Boccaccini's 2007 conference volume, which assembled the major Enoch scholars of the field and examined the question in detail, represents the scholarly consensus that the parables are a Jewish composition from the late 1st century BCE or early 1st century CE, composed before the New Testament, not after it. Millick's full commentary on the Aramaic fragments was never published. He died in 2006. His unpublished notes on the Qumran material remain in archives. This is documented in published discussions of the Qumran Enoch scholarship community. The source material's characterization of this situation is accurate. What remains genuinely open within mainstream Enoch scholarship, the precise date of the parable's composition, the reason for their absence from Qumran, and the relationship between the parable's Son of Man figure and the New Testament's use of the same title. These are active and genuinely unresolved scholarly questions. The source material's description of what the parables say is largely accurate and worth engaging with seriously. Chapter 46 of the Parables, in Ephraim Isaac's 1983 scholarly translation, does describe Enoch being shown the head of days and the Son of Man, followed by a description of earthly rulers whose power rests on wealth, who deny the Lord of spirits, and who persecute the faithful. George Nicholsburg's 2001 Hermenia commentary does characterize the kings and the mighty as the primary antagonists of the parables, not the watchers, not Azazel, not a single supernatural antichrist figure, but a class of corrupt earthly rulers whose power rests on riches and whose faith is in things they built. This characterization is documented in his published scholarship and represents the mainstream scholarly reading of the text. The four-movement structure the source material identifies, Chapter 46's introduction of the kings and the mighty, Chapter 48's pre-existence of the Son of Man, Chapters 52 to 53's mountains of metal that will not save the mighty, and Chapters 62 to 63's climactic judgment scene, is an accurate description of the parable's narrative arc as documented in scholarly translations and commentary. The distinction between Charles's 1906 translation and the later translations by Knibb and Isaac is real. Charles's translation reflects both the linguistic standards of Edwardian biblical scholarship and the conventions of his ecclesiastical context. Knibb's 1978 critical edition, produced after direct comparison with all available manuscript evidence and informed by Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship that did not exist in Charles's era, does render certain passages with greater directness. Isaac's 1983 direct Ge'ez translation does restore elements that Charles's translation softened or condensed. This is a documented feature of Enoch translation history discussed in the scholarship. The source material's characterization of Nicholsburg's position deserves direct engagement because it is one of the most significant mainstream scholarly observations in the parables literature. Nicholsburg does identify the kings and the mighty as the real antagonists of the parables. He does argue that they are not supernatural beings but human rulers, political and religious elites whose power rests on wealth and self-exaltation. He does argue that the persecution described in the parables happens through institutional channels rather than through open violence, through the houses of congregation, through the structures of religious and political authority itself. This is documented in his 2001 Hermenia commentary. It is not fringe scholarship. It is the position of the field's most authoritative contemporary commentator. What Nicholsburg does not argue, and what the source material's closing section begins to imply, but stops short of stating directly, is that any specific contemporary political or religious institution constitutes the kings and the mighty in a verifiable, demonstrable sense. His scholarly analysis identifies the pattern in the ancient text. It does not claim to identify current instances of that pattern. That extension is one this documentary also declines to make. The source material's observation about the relationship between Paul's description in 2 Thessalonians 2:3-4 and the Enochic pattern is a genuine area of New Testament and Second Temple scholarship. The parable's vocabulary, the one who exalts himself, who opposes the divine authority, who takes his seat in the place of worship, does share conceptual and linguistic parallels with Paul's man of lawlessness passage. Whether Paul was drawing directly on the Enochic parables, on Daniel 11, which shares similar language, or on a broader Second Temple Jewish eschatological tradition that informed both texts, is a genuine scholarly debate with published proponents of each position. The source material's argument that the pattern is native to Enoch and moved forward into Paul rather than backwards from Paul into Enoch is consistent with the mainstream scholarly dating of the parables to the late 1st century BCE or early 1st century CE, making them contemporary with or prior to Paul's letters rather than dependent on them. This is the consensus position after Boccaccini's 2007 volume. The source material's extended discussion of the parable's absence from Qumran is one of its most careful and genuinely interesting sections. It is worth engaging with the scholarly reality honestly. The absence is real and documented. The parables are the only major section of 1st Enoch with no Qumran Aramaic witness. Scholars have proposed multiple explanations. Millick's proposal, that the parables were composed after the Qumran community, is the explanation that makes the absence least surprising, but that requires the parables to be a composition later than most of the Qumran material. This has been rejected by the scholarly consensus for reasons documented in published work. The explanation that has gained the most traction in mainstream Enoch scholarship: the parables may have been composed by a Jewish community or author not associated with the Qumran sect, at roughly the same period as the Qumran texts, but in a different context. The Qumran community did not collect every Jewish text of the Second Temple period. Their collection reflects their specific sectarian interests and theological concerns. The parable's absence may reflect the Qumran community's limited interest in this specific composition rather than the composition's non-existence. A third possibility, discussed in the scholarship without definitive resolution: the parables may have been composed slightly later than the Qumran texts, after the community ceased copying, without requiring Christian authorship. None of these explanations is definitively established. The absence remains a genuine scholarly puzzle. The source material's framing of it as a whole in the shape of the passage is evocative. The more precise scholarly framing is that it is an absence whose cause is debated and not yet resolved. The source material's description of the Council of Laodicea is accurate in its essentials. The council did meet in 364 CE. It did produce 60 canons. Canon 59 did prohibit the reading of non-canonical books in church. The list of canonical books that Canon 60 specified did not include Enoch. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church was operating outside Roman authority and did not adopt the Laodicean canon as binding. James Bruce did bring 3 Ge'ez manuscripts to Europe in 1773. These are all documented historical facts. The source material's interpretation, that the council specifically targeted the parable's description of the kings and the mighty because it could be read against imperial power, is a proposed historical argument. It is one possible explanation for the text's exclusion. Whether it was the primary motivation, one of several considerations, or a secondary factor in a process driven more by questions of authorship and apostolic connection, is a question that the documented council records do not definitively settle. Jerome's and Augustine's documented concerns about Enoch are on record and do address the text's cosmological and angel material more than its political critique. What can be independently verified? Manuscript Bruce 74 is real and held at the Bodleian Library. The Qumran Enoch fragments 4Q201, 4Q212 are real and dated. The parable's absence from Qumran is real and documented. Charles, Knib, Isaac, Nicolsburg, Millick, Vanderkam, and Boccaccini are all real scholars with verifiable published work. Nicolsburg does identify the kings and the mighty as corrupt earthly rulers rather than supernatural beings. This is in his published commentary. The Paul Enoch vocabulary parallel is a real area of documented New Testament scholarship. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church's continuous preservation of Enoch is documented. What is genuinely debated within mainstream scholarship: the precise date of the parable's composition, the cause of their Qumran absence, and the specific relationship between the Enochic kings and mighty and New Testament Antichrist typology. What this documentary does not endorse any identification of specific contemporary individuals, institutions, or political systems as the kings and the mighty in the sense described by the parables. The text describes a pattern. Whether and how that pattern applies to any specific contemporary situation is a theological and political judgment that falls outside the scope of documentary presentation. The Book of Parables is a genuine ancient Jewish text, composed before the New Testament, preserved only in Ethiopia, translated into English 3 times by 3 of the most respected scholars in the field, that describes corrupt earthly power with a specificity that its most authoritative modern scholarly commentator has characterized as unusually concrete. Nicolsburg's identification of the kings and the mighty as human rulers rather than supernatural figures, and his argument that their oppression happens through institutional channels rather than open violence, is a mainstream scholarly position that has not been adequately engaged with in mainstream Western Christianity. Whether the pattern the parables describe is historically specific to its Second Temple context, perpetually recurring across human history, or something else entirely, is a question that the text raises without resolving, and that honest engagement with it should leave open rather than answer prematurely. The manuscript is in Oxford. The commentary is published and available. The gap in the Qumran record is real and documented. These facts are worth knowing accurately. This documentary examines historical and textual topics for educational purposes only. The scholarly citations reflect real, published academic work. The positions attributed to Nicolsburg, Vanderkam, Isaac, Knibb, Charles, Millick, and Boccaccini are documented in their published works. Nothing in this documentary should be understood as identifying any specific contemporary person, institution, or political system as the kings and the mighty described in the Book of Parables. Viewers are encouraged to consult peer-reviewed Enoch scholarship and their own trusted religious and academic sources.